That sounds suspiciously like a Beatles chord, doesn't it? But we're not doing the Beatles. All right, let's see if we can get this guitar to resonate with my voice. I am Superman, and I can do anything. I am Superman, I know what's happening. You don't really love that guy you make it with now, do you? I know you don't love that guy, 'cause I can see right through you. If you go a million miles away, I'll track you down, girl. Trust me when I say I know the pathway to your heart. I am Superman, I know what's happening. I am Superman, I can do anything. All right, that'll have to be good enough. I Am Superman. That was one of my favorite songs by R.E.M. in the 80s. But you know what? It's not an original R.E.M. song. Nope, there's a band called The Click, and they were the ones that created and first recorded this song. And guess what year? 1969. I was all 5 years old. Kind of appropriate because at that time, boy, superheroes were hitting me hard. I was watching Underdog on TV, you know, he had that ring where he had a pill inside and he'd pop the pill and he'd become Underdog. I'm still popping pills trying to be Underdog. Supplements for blood flow and everything else. I was born in 1964, June, summer of Beatlemania. So I've been influenced my whole life by the kind of creativity that was exploding in the 1960s and carried over to the 70s and 80s. And, you know, it wasn't just the Beatles. It wasn't just the British Invasion, of course. It was all kinds of music. Beach Boys, Good Vibrations, when I first heard that, just incredible. All the different genres of music, Motown and country rock, hard rock, psychedelia, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Light My Fire, all of that. If there was anything else besides music that was driving the cultural change and the artistic, you know, kind of the incredible well of creativity, I would have to say it was pop art and specifically comics. And, you know, you credit Marvel Comics with that in large part for changing, I guess, the dynamic of what superheroes could be, what superhero comics could be. Now, you had people like Roy Lichtenstein, you know, supposed serious artists in the 60s. I'm not saying he's not, but to me, just because the art in comic books wasn't recognized as art at the time doesn't mean that real artists got to make it art. It was already art. I once worked with David Rabe, the playwright, and was working on an original unpublished play of his. I was directing it. And he told me in the course, you know, we were talking about plays and stuff, and he mentioned a play by Christopher Durang, The Vietnamization of New Jersey. Now, in that play, Durang was satirizing, he thought, a play by David Rabe, Sticks and Bones. You know, but Dave Rabe told me, he said, you can't satirize what's already satire. And he had a problem with Durang's play because of that. And I kind of saw his point, because Sticks and Bones was kind of taking the Ozzie and Harriet sitcom, or, you know, the old show, and in a way, darkly satirizing that viewpoint and that, you know, kind of view of culture and families and the whole American dream, right? So that's the way I see with this comic book art. It was so much more important and having an influence, even if it wasn't recognized at the time as art. I mean, for God's sakes, you have people like Johnny Romita and Neil Adams and Frank Frazetta and John Buscema and so many, Steve Ditko, so many great freaking artists that did eventually get their due for the amazing things that they created. Of course, I mean, look at today's world. I mean, superhero movies are the biggest thing on earth. Spider-Man, the new movie that just came out. Okay, it was impacting me, impacting my sense of what I wanted to do, my sense of, what was important. Creativity. I really didn't fully get it, I suppose, until I started collecting comic books. So I'll tell the story of that. I was in the 3rd grade. I had some comic books, but I couldn't call myself a collector until I met a kid in Mrs. Rodak's class in Violet Avenue School up in Hyde Park named Jim Norman. Now, let me give a little bit. I was at 185 Mill Street, for the first few years of my life, and then we moved to an apartment around the corner from Mill Street in Poughkeepsie. My mom remarried in '67. Stepdad, not a great dude, won't talk too much about him right now. But in 1969, we moved up to Hyde Park to a place called Bradley Village. There were these ranch houses that were built on concrete slabs. They were built right after World War II, with the idea that soldiers returning home from the war would want to start families and they needed affordable housing. Well, this was the house that my mom was able to put a down payment on in 1969. We moved there, so I was going to Violet Avenue School, met Jim Norman. Jim was a real comic book collector and he was a real artist. I like to draw, but Jim was on a whole different level. He really studied these comics from his collection. He could draw the Hulk incredibly. He could draw the Incredible Hulk. He could draw Spider-Man, which was his favorite. Kind of funny because he was big and bulky and I was skinny. And my favorite was the Hulk. His favorite was Spider-Man. So that was kind of funny. But Jim opened me to the idea, oh my gosh, comic book collecting. And we decided that we'd do a comic book together because we both like to draw. So we stapled some sheets of paper together. Mrs. Rodak was so nice, she let us go into the back clothes closet in the classroom and spend about 15 or 20 minutes every morning before class started, and we'd work on this comic. Well, Jim had a superhero, and his name was Zarkon. What a name for a superhero, right? I mean, Zarkon. And he had these bands, these lines, these cool lines over his whole body, and Jim shaded him so that you just knew he was metallic looking, and he had great muscles, and he had horns. And funny thing is, he had a kind of Beatles wig for hair. But somehow it all worked. Well, I had to come up with a superhero to fight Zarkon, and I didn't have a superhero when we started this project. So, Jim's drawing the cover of the issue, and Zarkon versus, and leaves a blank. And so then I have to step up and draw my superhero. So, I'm kind of winging it. I start drawing something and I figure on a hairy beast, sort of like a King Kongish type beast. And I gave it jagged teeth and I kind of slanted the eyebrows down to give it a mean, psychotic look. And, of course, I gave it horns, to match Zarkon. And then I had to come up with a name for this thing. So, I did. Killer. Probably from watching wrestling, I don't know. I had a ways to go to rise up to Jim's level of originality and creativity, that's for sure. But, everybody has to start somewhere. But that started my more formal comic book collecting. I started going up to Muzzy's, which was 5 doors up from Mill Street in Poughkeepsie. My mom would leave us older kids, with my grandmother and my great-grandfather on weekends. So I was there with my great-grandfather. I got to know him, Corrado, and my grandmother, Connie. God bless her, she funded my comic book habit. And, it's no small thing because money was always really tight, especially at the end of the month. But somehow she would find, a quarter or 50 cents and give it to me so I could go up and get a comic book or two. Over the weeks and months, that adds up, and I was able to build a collection. My favorite, as I said, was the Hulk, so I had to have that every month. And then, I could choose what else I liked. I liked the Defenders. Now, that was a superhero group that was new at the time. And, the Avengers was the big group. And Defenders was kind of a new group. Some disaffected members of the Avengers, like Hawkeye and the Hulk, was part of the Defenders. Also Doctor Strange, and then there was the Valkyrie. I mean, this really kick-ass gal who was, gorgeous, and she had breastplates. And she had a winged horse, a white horse, a stallion, which was just incredible. So I immediately glommed onto that. I do remember that there was a crossover between the Defenders comic and the Avengers comic. Something like Defenders 9 and then Avengers and then Defenders 11 or 10 and 11. It was really cool because you got to see battles between the Avengers and the Defenders. So the Hulk was fighting Thor, and I think Hawkeye might have been fighting Black Panther maybe, or Captain America. Valkyrie maybe against Scarlet Witch, I'm not sure. But, I would choose other comics as, the covers appeal to me. Covers are everything, and people in the biz know that. It's amazing how some people who publish magazines, because I work with some, they don't realize how important the covers are to selling the product. I remember getting the first issue of Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu. This was circa 73 or 74, and I guess you had to be back in that time to know just how important Kung Fu and karate fighting was. There was the Kung Fu TV show, of course, with David Carradine. You had Bruce Lee movies, and Kung Fu fighting was on the radio. So, if you were in a fight in your neighborhood, and believe me, we'd get in fights in our neighborhood. If you didn't know karate, and most of us didn't, you'd fake it. You'd try to, some kicks and stuff like that. What else did I have? I had so many. I mean, my comic book collection was, if I had it today, let's just say I would be in a palace right now instead of this humble abode. But I had the first appearance ever of the Wolverine. That was in a Hulk comic. And what's funny is the actual first appearance of the Wolverine isn't that iconic cover where he's leaping, against the Hulk. It's the issue before where the Hulk is fighting this beast called the Wendigo. Funnily enough, the Wendigo, he's sort of a hairy creature with jagged teeth and angry-looking psychotic eyes, and not too far removed from Killer, my own superhero. Now, I'll say the Wendigo is a better name for a mythical creature, I guess, in the Canadian wilderness, and he also had white fur, so I give him credit for that. All right, what other comics did I have? My grandmother funded it, as I said. She was so generous. She would even take me up to another store where they had a wider selection of comics. Now, this store was called Milt Cigar Store. It was located on Market Street in Poughkeepsie, right at the end of Cannon Street. And it was a little shack that was pea green, and I think it had some yellow, some pale yellow, like piss yellow, pea green and piss yellow. And it was between two government buildings, definitely the DMV. And it was kind of diagonally across from the Bardavon 1869 Opera House. The reason why I give all that is because it's not there anymore. It was torn down. But at that time, it was an amazing place to go into to get a wider selection of comics. One thing I remember that I got there was the giant-sized issue that was the first ever crossover between DC and Marvel. It was Superman versus Spider-Man. Wow. You had Neil Adams drawing Superman, and you had Johnny Romita Jr. drawing Spider-Man. You couldn't ask for better than that. Now Milt, he was a dude who looked like Jabba the Hutt, basically. He always wore a white kind of t-shirt. I should talk, I'm always wearing this thing. And he sat there back there at his seat smoking a cigar behind like a plastic wall, which was kind of funny because it's sitting there right between government buildings. You would think it would be relatively safe, but I guess not. I guess there was some crime, maybe people grabbing something, running out. But right behind him, there was like a pinned row of girly magazines that was impossible to miss for a young lad. Couldn't buy those, so I stuck to comics. His wife was usually at the register. She was usually doing most of the actual work. But, oh yeah, what else did I get there? I got the Kiss comic book, or it actually looked more like a magazine. I think that was put out by Marvel. It was probably somewhere around 75 or 76. Kiss, of course, was out with Destroyer, and Love Gun was just about, ready to come out, I guess. But, I was right in the pocket for all that stuff. And, of course, they were rock star superheroes, the way they dressed. But the selling point for this magazine was that it was printed with real Kiss blood. I guess they'd each contribute a vial into the ink that was in the printing press, But I had that comic as well. Okay, I had Star Wars, #1. I had the first 20-something issues of Star Wars. What's funny about that is I knew it was going to be worth something. I bought a couple copies of that first issue, and I put it in plastic. Yep, mid-70s. I was putting comics in plastic because I knew they would be worth something. The Eternals. Jack Kirby, he was with DC for a while. I didn't really collect a lot of DC comics, but I collected a few. And OMAC, I really liked that one. That was drawn by Jack Kirby for DC. And he was like a kinetic fighting dude. And Jack Kirby was so good at evoking action and movement in his artwork. I mean, I know he did the space stuff, the galaxies, and that was so particular and iconic, his style for that. But just his sense of action. And OMAC had this huge black mohawk, which is kind of funny because later, with punk music and alternative music, I was working in bars later, in my late teens and early 20s, and I worked with guys who had mohawks, and I loved alternative music. Never had a mohawk myself, but it's just kind of funny that it all became, part of the real style and culture. When he returned to Marvel for a while, he came out with The Eternals. I had first issue and then the first 20 issues of that magazine. What else? I guess, what I want to say is that comics opened me up to fantasy and sci-fi, and it was pretty straightforward. It's not too far to go from reading a comic book to reading, say, John Carter, Warlord of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And that's pretty much what happened. In fact, I had the John Carter comic book that Marvel put out in the 70s. But, H.G. Wells and Howard Pyle, Men of Iron, it was comic books more than even the movies. Because we watched movies like Jason and the Argonauts and Sinbad and, Journey to the Center of the Earth. So I watched the sci-fi and Planet of the Apes and Omega Man and, Soylent Green. But it was really reading with comic books that made me want to read more and not just kid books. Now, I'd read Roald Dahl and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and that kind of opened me up to fantasy because I went through his books. But it was comic books that led me to this other fantasy and sci-fi stuff. So then I was reading Arthur C. Clarke in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Robert A. Heinlein in Stranger in a Strange Land, and Isaac Asimov, the Foundation trilogy. I remember in 7th grade, I was in Haviland Junior High, I was in the library, and I come across this fat book. And those always appeal to me because, they look hard to read, and I like to challenge myself. So I pick it up, I open it up, and I see this thing, a wizard, and elves, and dwarves, and hobbits. What are these things called hobbits? Well, it was Return of the King. It was the 3rd book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So I figured that out after a minute or two, and then I searched around, I found the first book. I ended up reading the whole trilogy in the 7th grade. Funnily enough, my mom divorced in 77. We moved back from Hyde Park down to Mill Street, again, 185 Mill. And I transferred schools. I went to St. Mary's in Poughkeepsie for 8th grade. Well, it was a culture shock because it was a much smaller school. There were maybe 13 girls and 8 boys in the whole 8th grade. But I made really good friends with a couple guys. We got the idea, and it was partly because I exposed them to Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien and The Hobbit. We decided to do The Hobbit as a stage play. So we each took a third of the book and we transferred it, we made it into dialogue and scenes and stuff like that. And we got permission from our principal, Sister Margaret Mary, very stern lady, to kind of work on this stage play. And we could do it with like the 6th graders and the 7th graders and 8th graders. Well, we were there after lunch in this auditorium, and we were trying to get the kids to block out the scenes and do stuff. And they just wanted to fight with the sticks and pretend with the sword play and stuff like that. So it was trouble. We had a lot of difficulty controlling these younger kids. Sister Margaret Mary came in one day and she said, no, this isn't going to work. It's too dangerous. And so we never got to actually put on the play that we'd created. But I will say that was several decades before Peter Jackson did the movies. So I guess I'll wind this up by just saying that it was comic books that really opened me to that wider world of my own particular journey in creativity in my life. Now I'm blessed because I actually got to, in some phases of my life, do professional writing. And even recreationally or, work with professionals who were great Tony Award winning, Pulitzer Prize winning playwrights. And I wrote my own plays and did radio plays. And then I did nonfiction, worked for magazines, worked for newspapers. Have done creative writing, of novel writing, some erotic novels under a pen name. Nothing wrong with that. But, I credit really the time I grew up in, the time that kind of imprinted upon me what I consider important. That's why, as mediocre as I play guitar after all these years, I played bass in a new wave band back in college. That's a whole other story for another episode. But I've always stayed with music too, singer, songwriting stuff, writing original songs, because that's what I enjoy. That's my passion. And yeah, it's inside all of us. But I think particularly for me, it was the culture of my time that kind of spurred me in my particular journey.